Just a quick show of hands. Who was here last summer? Okay, so I'm sure you remember everything I said last summer, right? It's okay. You know, I'm talking on a different topic, but I'm going to, at the beginning, mention a few things that I mentioned last summer, just to kind of set the stage. What I did talk about last summer sort of was an understanding of the human person, okay? And I used some insights from St. John Paul the Great that he communicated through lectures that he calls the Theology of the Body, sort of an understanding of how the body and the soul fit together, and what does the body mean for the human person. And so that's going to be sort of my springboard, though, for talking about technology today, because I'm talking in particular about our ways of communicating these days. All right, sometimes it's called, you know, social communication technology, anything that we use to communicate with other persons. And so, of course, you know, I'm talking about our phones, Instagram, texting, the different ways that we have. But one of the things that they all have in common today is that those forms of communication sort of involve the body less and less, right? If we're communicating with people through our phones, we're not communicating sort of in the flesh with our bodies, okay? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the consequences of that. But what I wanted to review a little bit from my talk last summer, something that I emphasized was that there is a profound difference in the way in which we come to know a person than from the way in which we come to know an object or a thing, okay? You know, we can study objects, right? Scientists can experiment, we can dissect, we can research, right? We can test, right? There's ways in which we find out about the world. However, those techniques are not used successfully in trying to know a person, right? I mean, you can interrogate a person, you can subject them to tests, you can study them, you can read their history, you can read their, you know, you can read a biography of a person, you can read a person's medical history. You can certainly learn many things about that person. But you can't take a person apart. You can't dissect them like a frog. You can't just read their resume or read their Facebook page and really expect to know them. We get this, right? It just doesn't work like that, okay? And so, you know, I always used to laugh before the world of the internet. We used to find out about celebrities and things sort of from the checkout line. You know, you're standing in the checkout line, you see all the magazines, all the latest romances and murders, or, you know, whatever. You learn about things, or you're sitting in the dentist's office and you're like, you know. But, so you might learn a lot about people or celebrities or things that way through magazines. That was the old way. Now, you know, through Instagram or through any of the various applications. But you really don't expect to come to know them that way. Knowing a person, actually getting to know someone, always comes, never through detachment and study, okay? It only ever comes through attachment, okay? Through real live encounter with another person, through conversation, and through shared experiences, okay? And we not only come to know others only in this way, really to know them, okay? But we can only come to know and understand ourselves through this very same encounter, okay? That's the reason we're born into a family, right? We're not sprouted in cabbage patches, right? We come into the world surrounded by a little community of persons, right? And they're all staring at that baby going, yay, right? There's this sort of like, this sort of applause, right? And it would be bad if it was any other way, right? We know that if a baby doesn't receive cuddling and loving and cooing and speaking and nurture, that baby's not gonna understand who they are. They're not gonna know who they are. They're not gonna know there's something precious and wonderful, right? And I think this is sad, but I mentioned this last summer. They did studies in the early 90s when there was orphanages in Romania that were just overflowing with babies. There was not enough people to take care of them. They were feeding them, but no one was around there just to even to touch, to physically touch and cuddle these little babies. And many of them literally died. Like they had food. They were changed, but they died from that lack of that physical touching that expressed that love, right? That expressed that contact with another human being that helped them to understand, who they were. No one to respond to them. And that's what I mean. And I just want to mention 2 quick biblical examples of this. When in the Genesis story in the Bible, when Adam is, in a sense, trying to figure out who he is, right? He's trying to find a helper fit for him. The Bible says that God says it is not good for man to be alone. So man is kind of figuring out who he is, and God then presents him with all of the animals, right? One by one, Adam observes the animals. He gives them names, but he didn't find anyone fit for him, okay? So of course then, God makes Eve, and when he first sees Eve, what are the words that come out of Adam's mouth? Yes, so in recognizing her, yes, at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, we see something interesting. Obviously, he rejoices in her, he's happy, but he's actually saying something more than just, wow, this is it, right? He's saying, this is bone of my bones, this is flesh of my flesh. He is recognizing himself in her. He's figuring out who he is by going, yes, you're like me, yes, I see that now. So in that moment, he's not just coming to know her, he's also coming to know himself more deeply. So we all need that, right? We need contact with other people to know ourselves. And a New Testament sort of example of that, I think, is when Jesus goes to the seashore, right? And Peter and the apostles aren't catching any fish, right? And they've been fishing all night, and Jesus says, go lower your nets for a catch. And Peter's like, you can only imagine what Peter was thinking, right, at that time, like, And of course, they go out, the nets are overflowing, and do you guys remember what does Peter say to Jesus?
Get out of here, I'm not worthy.
He says, depart from me, I'm a sinner. And the connection I'm making here is that when Jesus encountered God made flesh, right, the most perfect human being and God, right, he meets him, and instead of saying, wow, you're the Messiah, right, he says, I'm a sinner, depart from me. He gains immediate self-knowledge through that encounter. Now, he was focusing on how he doesn't measure up, right? We all have to have that too. That is part of self-knowledge, right? But Jesus doesn't dwell on that. He's like, don't worry, now you're going to be catching men, right? Jesus points him forward, right? But he has to have that initial starting point of he knew himself in that encounter. Okay, so when we have encounters, we do come to know ourselves. Sometimes for good, sometimes for ill, right? And in family life, we need both, right? I think of it, I need to tell my children I love them every day. I need to pay attention to them. I need them to know. I need to communicate to them through the way I relate to them how wonderful they are. And then they'll figure it out, right? But what if I never correct any of their flaws, right? If I never point out when they're being selfish or being sloppy, right? If I never point out their flaws, they might get a little bit of a skewed sense of who they are. I had a funny story. I was talking to a guy I know who's he and his wife had homeschooled their child up until this past year, so he entered into 4th grade. And I mean, I'm a homeschooler and I love it, but there was this funny moment after the first week of school, because the child never had anybody else in his class before. He came home and said, Mom and Dad, it was a good week, but I found out that I wasn't the smartest kid. Just like that one moment, it's like, he had kind of come away with that impression, and that's okay too. But there's this way in which you need that, right? You need that encounter to find the truth. And then, if you still want to be the smartest kid, I guess you got to ramp it up a little bit. You got to work a little harder. So yes, we all, as human beings, as fallen human beings, we need constructive criticism at times from those who love us. But even more, right? We crave loving feedback from those around us. But But I think, if you think about your own experiences, siblings living together, roommates living together, going on road trips with people, when you are thrown into bodily contact with people, you gotta spend time, you gotta run a camp together, right? You get to know them, you get to know yourselves, and again, sometimes those experiences can make us roll our eyes, oh, so-and-so annoys me, or this or that, but unless you have those experiences, you can't grow, right? You're gonna have totally skewed self-image about yourself, right? And you're not gonna be able to know others. You have to have contact. Any kind of knowing outside of that is gonna be perhaps less reliable, right? If you're just relying on people's social media pages to get to know them, that's not real. I wanted to read a quotation from Father Jacques Philippe on this. He says, as persons, as human beings, he says, we need to be looked upon by someone who says, as God did through the prophet Isaiah, you are precious in my eyes and honored, and I love you. We urgently need the mediation of another's eyes to love ourselves and accept ourselves. Okay, there's something about the human person. The human person doesn't exist in a vacuum. The human person requires a witness. Okay, just as Adam needed Eve to know himself, each person must be sort of reflected back to himself in some way. Okay, and we understand sometimes, if people don't receive this perfectly, right, in their families, it hurts, right? If a parent isn't there, or if there's wounds in the family, and it's or abuse or neglect, right? We know that if a person grows up in an environment where others aren't rejoicing in his presence, or others aren't properly guiding and correcting when necessary, there's gonna be wounds there, and there's gonna be pain. Okay, it doesn't mean it's insurmountable, but we see it, right? But then when we grow up and we go out into the world, we need to be capable of healthy relationships. And so this is why, again, we can't choose the families that we're born into, right? But then we go out and we start making these new relationships and friendships. And so here's where we're coming to this idea of how are our friendships, our relationships with others that we freely choose, right, as we go out into life, how are they affected when we take the body sort of out of the equation? Okay, disembodied communication. I want to put it into, I guess, 3 ways. If I had a board, I'd write 3 things on the board. I think our social communication technology promises 3 things. It promises that we're going to be, I guess, happier in our relationships, right? Because we can be in touch, right, with so many people, right? Far and near, especially far, right? The far ends of the earth, right? Everyone's at within our reach, okay? They promise that they're going to make us smarter, right? We can know so much more because of this amazing information highway. And they promise, in a sense, to make us safer, right? There's something very safe about being able to, I'm here, people are out there, right? It's very safe. You can sort of protect yourself, right? You can control what you put out there. You can control your image, right? You can put only the best pictures of yourself, and you can filter them and you can tweak them, right? You can stress for hours about the perfectly witty comment or something you're gonna put. You feel like there's something very safe, right? You're safe from the worst thing of all, which is awkwardness, right? Because awkwardness is awful, right? And so we feel that, oh, there's just something really safe about it, right? And I've talked to, many, many, many parents who, even when I've pointed out some of the dangers, it's all about safety for them too, right? Well, my child will be safe. I need to know where they are, and they need to have this just in case. It's all safety, safety, safety. We always hear that. So I want to go through each one real quick and, point out the bad things at first. So the body, in terms of the first one, right? Okay. We're going to be able to have better in terms of sort of more. We can keep up with more people. We can keep up with old friends. We can make new ones. We can, keep in touch, keep those people that are far away sort of present. We can sort of make them here because the body's no longer a problem, right? You can relate to them through this device instead of in the flesh. And there's something to that, but something that we don't usually focus on is what does that mean for those around us, okay? When we look back into the book of Genesis, right? When Adam was presented with Eve, does the Bible tell us that he gave her a long interview to make sure that she was going to be a fitting companion? Well, the Bible's pretty sparse in its words, but it seems pretty clear that he knew instantly that she was going to be the right fit. And how did he know that? After having named all the animals and decided that they were found wanting in some way. What do you think it was if we don't see her getting a long interview to make sure she's sort of a worthy companion? I'll pick on you, Declan. What was it that probably instantly made it clear to Adam that Eve was a fellow human being? Sorry, I didn't need to put you on the spot. It's the answer to every question in this class. Body, right? Like, he saw a human body, right? And a human body is, when we see a human body, right? We don't just see a human body, okay? We see a human person. We see that the body is that physical dimension, but we believe that there's more, right? And so, you know, somebody said once that, like, the body is the original instant messenger, right? It says there's a person here, okay? And when John Paul II talks about that original experience, he says, you know, in that moment, because the Bible also tells us that Adam and Eve didn't have any clothes on, okay? But it says that they were naked without shame. And that's sort of a whole nother talk, but in that moment, St. John Paul says, they weren't looking at each other's bodies. Adam didn't see Eve's body, and Eve didn't see Adam's body. When he saw Eve's body, no. He just saw Eve. And Eve saw him. Their bodies communicated their invisible dimensions. Okay, their body was the thing that announced, human person here. Okay, and so when we see physical bodies, we're not just supposed to see physical bodies, we're supposed to see persons. Okay, because of sin, we don't always see that. Okay, there's a dark part of man that sometimes can look at another person and just see garbage, or just see sexy body parts, you know, something like that, where we're not focusing on the person. But sin aside, the way in which we're designed is to see a human body, we see a human person, okay? But what happens is, I think we all know, is that when we get really drawn into our social communication technology, it becomes so easy to become totally insensitive to the human bodies that are like sitting right next to us, right? It's very easy to just totally ignore everyone else and just kind of get lost, right? So when we're supposedly having better personal relationships, we're totally ignoring the people that are actually here in our midst. And we've all been there, right? And sometimes we do it on purpose. If it's like, that person seems awkward, I'm gonna be saved from the awkwardness by pretending that I'm busy right now. But other times we don't mean to do it at all. And so there is something just sort of inherently worrisome about becoming insensitive to the people around you, especially in a family or in a group of friends. But what I want to talk about is sort of the opportunity cost. Because when we are focusing on people or things that are essentially abstract from us, and we're ignoring the people that are actually the real concrete people around us, we miss out on a couple of things. We miss out on, I'd say, well, we miss out on one thing, but there's several dimensions to it. We miss out on having a shared experience. And we miss out, many times in life, shared experiences are spontaneous, right? We don't necessarily plan that cool conversation that we got into, or we don't plan that little adventure that, you know, I don't know, you're in college, you're sitting around, oh, let's go run out and get tacos, you know, or let's go do this thing, right? You don't always plan those things, right? They happen. And as a mom with a lot of kids, I can tell you, like, when my kids say they're bored, I mean, you hate to hear those words, I'm bored, but what I've usually found is if I don't immediately try to sort of like fill that empty space, what do kids do if they're bored for a while? They usually find something. usually has to do with like cardboard. It usually ends up making a huge mess, but they end up doing something creative. You know, like they'll make up a game, and they'll build a fort. Like they do something fun. And later on, I'm like cleaning it up, and I'm like, oh, this is so great. This is so great. No, it is great, right? Because they did something together, and they did something creative. So we actually are meant to have these experiences, but we do need some sort of open time. We do need a little bit of unplanned sort of bored time, you know, where all of a sudden we gotta do something. We have to do something in this moment, and we didn't plan it, okay? And that can be kind of scary too, right? Because we like to have control, we like to plan. And so when we miss out on these experiences, I mean, it's actually kind of a big deal. We need these experiences because that's actually how you really get to know people, right? Because you're doing something together. I mean, most people, if they'll tell you sort of how they met some of their best friends or how they met their spouse, they're gonna say, well, you know, we were thrown together in this club, or we ended up being the ones cleaning up after an event, or, you know, whatever, or we played on a team together. There has to be something that sort of brings you into physical contact, right? But again, you can't always plan these things, especially conversations, you know, where people really do sort of slowly reveal depths of who they are. Because you don't get to know anybody in a day, right? You might think you do. You might get a good first impression of somebody. You might get a bad first impression. But that first impression is never going to quite totally correspond to who they are. You need time, and you need shared experiences. And that's, I think, more the danger, where we're missing out on that. And even super lame shared experiences like, hey, let's watch a movie together. I mean, I grew up, my mom was, surprise, surprise, my mom was critical of technology. But she was more like, you know, too much TV, da-da-da-da. But we did get to watch some TV and some movies. But now, right, if your kids are fighting about what movie you're going to watch, everybody can actually just watch their own thing because you've got enough little screens, right? But there's something even about passively watching a movie together that's fun, right? You make comments, you watch it together, you can make the references to each other. It's just fun, right? But it bonds us, it draws us together. So we're missing out on a lot of those things. So again, and those are the ways that we actually get to know people. Those are the ways being thrown together. And this is just gonna happen less and less if we have to deliberately plan and choose everything, right? And that's one other thing I wanted to mention, sort of a side note but related to this, is that while there's certainly a big element of freedom in the friends we choose, right? My mom used to say, you know, choose good friends, you know, your companions are such an influence, and yes, we do choose our friends, but it's not like we're choosing them out of some grand catalog of friends, right? I mean, we are put, and this is where God's providence really comes in, right? God's providence, I can't help the fact, right? You guys can't help the fact that you were born, and the year you were born, and the town you were born, and the family you were born. There is so much about your life that you had nothing to do with choosing, right? But that's God's providence. He can surround you with circumstances and people, even challenges, even difficulties that actually, if responded to, you know, with effort and trust, can actually yield beautiful things. You know, so we don't want to be missing some of the really amazing informative experiences that we could be having just because we're not paying attention. Okay, just because we think, well, this is just more interesting than that. Okay, because we don't know. And just one more thing before I go to the second point is that when it comes to those open times, those awkward bored times where we could just easily fill it in with scrolling down a screen or talking to somebody else far away, is prayer. Because God is always there. He's literally like sitting there waiting for us all day, every day, right? It's not like he comes and goes. We're the ones that come and go, right? And so if we're in the habit of filling every dull moment in the day, every awkward moment, every filler moment, you can always find something remotely interesting on a screen. We're cutting him out. We're cutting those opportunities for the Holy Spirit. Just like kids get creative when they're bored, well, the Holy Spirit is absolutely, right? The Spirit moves you, right? He's absolutely our inspiration. That's the word inspiration, right? Spirit. And so opportunities to pray. Do you ever think, like sometimes you're in a shower or you're just sitting quietly at a doctor's office, there's just like a moment and then you'll get like a great thought, insight, and it's because the Holy Spirit, you can finally hear the Holy Spirit, right? He's there, we're just not listening. And so if we're gonna be nurturing our spiritual life, and there aren't those open moments in the day, then we're gonna be shutting out the Holy Spirit as well. Okay, so I mentioned better relationships, kind of a myth, smarter people. Okay, are we actually going to be smarter? Well, there's so much information out there, right? Now, there's a lot of bad things out there, a lot of false things. We get that. But like, there's a lot of good stuff too. When you take the body out of the equation, right, you sort of take physical limits out of the equation, right? Just like, oh, I can be friends with somebody, you know, a billion miles away. Oh, so instead of having this little stack of books next to my bed that I have to try to read through, I suddenly have access to so much great stuff to read, right? So much stuff to learn from. We think we have no limits. It really gives us a sense of infinity as far as the information that we can get and the knowledge we can gain. But what's the flip side? Can you actually read like 1,000 great articles? Can anybody? I mean, are our brains meant to read 1,000 articles a day? No. What do we do instead?
Memes.
We do memes. Thank you, right? And I mean, like, there's something a good meme is good because it does manage to capture in just a few words, right, an emotion, a feeling, a logic. Lou?
You just start skimming.
Right? I mean, and that's why. We can only read memes after a while because we've become a culture of skimmers, right? And when you skim, I compare it to skimping on food, like during Lent, right? We're skimping on some of our favorite treats, we're fasting or abstaining, we're skimping on food, right? But you think that on Easter Sunday morning, you're gonna eat an entire cow. I plan to eat everything. I dream about the massive quantities of food that I'm gonna eat on Easter. But then I'm like 5 jelly beans in, and I'm like, shoot, what happens if you've been fasting and you try to eat a whole bunch? Mateo.
Your stomach is smaller, so you can't eat as much.
It's like almost maddening, isn't it? You're like, shoot. I mean, we should be happy, but we're like, oh, come on, man. Or at least I'm like that. I'm like, your stomach actually shrinks when you fast. Unfortunately, your attention span shrinks when you skim. When you skim, just, you know, your stomach shrinks when you skim, your attention span shrinks when you skim. And then it makes it actually very difficult to maintain your concentration and to follow the argument, right? And then what have we done? We're sacrificing depth, right? Because we thought we could take it all in, right? Instead of actually focusing on a good book and maybe reading it a few times, right? We thought we had to have all of this. So in the same way with relationships, right? And again, you guys know this. If your social media profile says you have 1,000 friends, you're like, well, they're not really my friend. I mean, we get that friend has been sort of robbed of its meaning, right? But the point is, if you're trying to keep up with all those people, even if some of them are good people, maybe some are friends from grade school, you really did like them, right? But if you don't have the time and space to keep up with all of these friendships, then what happens to the friendships? Superficial, right? Just like you get a superficial knowledge when you're trying to cram too much in. So we see that this aspect of, are we smarter? Do we have more depth? No, there's actually an inverse relationship there. Okay. We sacrifice depth. So the third point that I wanted to make, and it's going to kind of wrap things up, is this issue of safety, right? We thought that this stuff would make us safer. Our parents think putting a phone in everybody's hands makes us physically safer. I think for people, for teens and everybody, there's this sense in which you're safer from awkwardness, right? You're safer from just vulnerability in general, right? Because what's the scary thing about actually having to physically encounter and talk to somebody? What's scary about that?
It's hard to leave if you don't want to.
If you immediately regret that you've entered in, it's kind of hard to back up. It is. It's a risk, right? Because on the one hand, you risk putting yourself out there and having yourself be kind of rejected. Maybe they're not very nice back. But maybe you throw yourself in and they love it, and you're like, oh, maybe I'm not sure I signed up for that, right? So it goes both ways, right? There is risk. There is risk. It is absolutely the opposite of safe, right? And the thing is, yeah, sometimes we do get hurt, right? Sometimes we put ourselves out there and we get treated, we get rejected, we get ignored, we get abused. That's real, and the pain from that is really real, right? So on the one hand, we see that, but what's the alternative? If you're not willing to freely put yourself out there, there's never going to be a knowing divorces. There's never going to be a friendship or relationship because there really is risk on both sides. Because if you can't come to know somebody by force, right, it's got to be that it's through freedom, right? The opposite of force is freedom. But where there's freedom, oh my gosh, there's risk. And so that is scary. I think it keeps a lot of, it's so, and in the whole world of dating, I talk to a lot of young women. It's difficult, right? Because if a young man likes a young woman, she's dying to know if he likes her back, right? And he texts her. Does a text mean a guy wants to be your boyfriend? Sorry. No, a text is a very safe way, right? Because guys don't want to be rejected and hurt. That's a huge risk, right? So we think, okay, we'll just take these little baby steps. Everybody's keeping everybody at arm's distance because nobody wants to get hurt. But unfortunately, right? Love is the willingness to endure pain and to be hurt. If you love somebody, you literally put yourself, in every kind of relationship, right? As a mother, like I'm so happy to be a mother, but I never realized that when your child gets hurt, it hurts worse than when you get hurt, right? The degree of your love is absolutely in proportion to the degree in which you'll suffer. That's why Our Lady, right? She was so united with Jesus that when Simeon said, your own soul a sword shall pierce, when Jesus is pierced, she is literally pierced in that moment. She is so united to him that she experiences that pain. So we get it. There's no pain, no gain. And it doesn't mean we take like crazy risks, but the point is, that's just a fact, right? And again, this isn't super new, this sort of desire to be safe and to keep people at arm's distance. When I was growing up, we got voicemail. That was like an answering machine, but actually first we had an answering machine, and then we had the voicemail. And people started calling in sick for work and leaving a message. People started dumping people over the messages, right? Because it was like when you had something to say that maybe you felt awkward about or bad about, right? It was like so much easier to just sort of do it like that, right? So that of course is going to be, so that's nothing new. It's so much more in our everyday behavior now, right? Everything. We don't want to have that. And it makes it scarier and scarier to engage, right? People don't even want to call anybody because it's like, I think this is a big thing. The phone rings. Imagine picking it up and not looking at the caller ID because we didn't used to have caller ID. Imagine picking it up. You don't know who's on the other end. You don't know what they're going to ask of you. You don't know what awkward silences you're going to have to cover by making conversation. It's like this total unknown. What's funny is when we were kids, we thought that was fun. We would like rush, I'll get it, and we had a running at the phone. But now it's like, who is it? Like I had a kid. This is my husband. He sees like, it's my mom. He'll be like, here. Like, I'm like, okay, I got time about 5 minutes. So we get this. So there's the safety, right? But what I want to go is sort of, I think the root of this, though, has to do with the fact that I talked about in the first two examples, the body is how we actually know a person is there. The body is limited and can't actually be talking to 1,000 people at one time. You can actually be talking to like one person at a time, right? But when we're disembodied in our communication, suddenly, oh, no, the people are all here. They're not around me. And oh my goodness, I can, my body has no limits, time and space are no limits at all, right? Infinity, okay? The third thing is about the body is that when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, when they committed the first sin, they experienced shame, right? The very first thing they did, they were suddenly hiding. They were hiding from each other with the fig leaves. They were hiding in the bushes from God. We saw that immediately this experience of we did something wrong kind of made itself felt in the body. And that's how shame always works. Like when you're embarrassed about something, sometimes you blush. If you feel, maybe guilty about doing something, maybe you don't want to like look somebody in the eye. If somebody walks in on you and you're not properly dressed, oh my gosh, right? You like cover up. If, maybe if I always use this example, but there was a teacher that sometimes got on our nerves in high school, and whenever you would complain about her, she would always walk down the hall. She would be right there, and she would hear you talking about her, and then you just break into a sweat, right? So there's always a physical manifestation. It doesn't mean that our body is guilty of sin, but our body is like this witness, it's like this symbol, something's wrong. Whether it's your sin or somebody else's sin, our body knows it, right? There's these signs. But what happens when you take the body out of the equation? When you take the body out of the equation, shame kind of goes out the window. So when people are relating through their devices rather than in person, you know, on the one hand, it's really not a surprise that people are posting sexy pictures of themselves, stuff that maybe they, you know, would you actually have the nerve to walk out and, you know, wear that in a group of people? You know, there's this distance. We're not feeling the shame, not feeling the blush. But even in a sort of non-sexual realm, how about just charity? Right? When people disagree and have online disagreements, are they actually people talking to other people? Sometimes it feels like people just shooting at dummies. You know, it's like you see a person's words, you don't see a person, right? You just try to shoot it. You don't distinguish between somebody that might have experienced knowledge, wisdom in a certain area that might have something to offer, right? They're all together in the comment box, or they're all together in, you know, whatever it is. When you don't see a body, you don't see a person, and you can act in ways that just have no shame. And so that's the thing. The body is what reminds us that the person on the other side is in fact a person. And they're a three-dimensional person, right? We just have this desire to try to reduce, right? Whenever we use the word objectify, so it means seeing somebody as just a part, just one dimension, right? And again, sometimes it's sexually, and that's awful and harmful, but we can do it in other ways too, right? And sometimes we think about it, we want to control our image. We want to control our image online so people see us only saying these things and only wearing these things, or, you know, because we're so afraid of being, you know, you hear this a lot, being judged, right? It's like everyone is so afraid of being judged. But I think another way of saying that is people are afraid of being seen just as one dimension. I mean, imagine, you know, we all make mistakes, right? Imagine if I made this, you know, big embarrassing mistake in 7th grade and that defined me for the rest of my life, right? It's like, so does none of the good stuff I ever did matter? You know how that is? Like, and we can do that with people, or people do that with us when they just keep fixating on the one thing, right? It's a way of reducing so that we can dismiss. If I can reduce my enemy to something that I could just, to something less than a person, I can just dismiss them, okay? And so there's this, it's a real fear, but you know, you wonder if you were actually having a conversation with someone and you had a disagreement, you could actually talk about it or maybe explain what you meant. Well, no, I didn't mean this, right? When you're having a conversation with somebody, let's say that person is just mid-sentence, right? Would you just like walk away? No. I mean, I guess some people do. It's rude. So, you know, some people just start scrolling and they're like, okay, I'm sorry, you know, you're bored, right? But the point is, when you do see a body and you see a person, you see many dimensions, right? And even if you're gonna have a disagreement with somebody, you do see that they're a person. And if there's somebody you know, you can talk. It doesn't mean that you're always gonna maybe convince them of your side or vice versa, but it's about seeing them as a person and not just something to summarily dismiss. And when we take the body out of the equation, we don't have to look somebody in the eye, we don't have to let them finish, we don't have to sort of consider their whole being. It's that much easier to just dismiss, objectify. And that, again, so we see that's actually the opposite of safe. That's so unsafe. It's so unsafe that it gets people sort of, we see how people act. And then it does start to affect the way in which they act when they're in person. So again, okay, I'm gonna wrap up here. So we have this idea, right, that somehow this new way of communicating is always gonna make things better, gonna make us smarter, gonna make us safer. And I think there's very real ways that they do the opposite of those three things, but precisely because the body is taken out of the equation. And so sort of, you know, thinking again in our lives, ways in which things that might not have been considered grave a long time ago are, you know, answering a phone, talking to somebody, playing a game with your brothers and sisters, you know, just sitting around doing something that's actually sort of, I'd say, like, that involves physical encounter is actually extremely good for building a real relationship, for knowing others, for them knowing you, and then, again, opportunities to grow, because sometimes we are gonna, you know, I was thinking about the way in which sometimes we find out Like, I didn't really know I was a big slob till I got married. Sometimes people don't find out, I think about groups of roommates having to do an intervention on a roommate who would steal all their shampoo, like stuff like that. Like those things those kind of confrontations can be awkward in life, right? And sometimes they can go south. People are too proud, whatever. But actually, these kind of things, we can grow. And we can't grow unless we have them. So I wanted to end with a beautiful quote, and I think it was more kind of directed in a sense to, sometimes we are afraid to put ourselves out there. We're afraid because we all know we're imperfect, right? Maybe we have a more fragile sense of self-worth. Maybe we didn't get the affirmation we should have gotten growing up, right? Or maybe we've made a lot of mistakes and we wish we could come back from them, but the devil keeps reminding us of those mistakes, right? So a lot of times it's a real nervousness about your self-worth that keeps you from kind of putting out there and trying for good relationships and trying to foster that. And I wanted to close with this beautiful quote from John Paul II. He gave it to some youth back in 2002. And I was just going to read the last line, but I'll read the whole thing. He says, "Although I have lived through much darkness under harsh totalitarian regimes, I have seen enough evidence to be unshakably convinced that no difficulty, no fear is so great that it can completely suffocate the hope that springs eternal in the hearts of the young. You are our hope, the young are our hope. Do not let that hope die. Stake your lives on it." Here's the money quote. "We are not the sum of our weaknesses and failures. We are the sum of the Father's love for us and our real capacity to become the image of the Son." Okay, so whenever we feel we're not good enough, right? Because of our failures, because of maybe sufferings that we've endured that weren't our fault, right? God is there. He's not just there in an abstract way, right? He actually sacramentally is present for us precisely for that purpose, because he knew we need flesh and blood, right? That we're human beings. We don't need an abstract concept of God. I mean, we can conclude that God exists when we look at the world, but no, he gave himself to us in a very tangible way through the sacraments, right? And so when we go to him and we remember that he loves us so much, he died for us, right? And that can help reinforce our sense of, no, we don't have to earn love, right? That's a contradiction, right? We couldn't do it anyway, right? We didn't have to earn it. We're not undeserving of it. That's the whole point about love. You don't deserve it. You didn't earn it, right? But we are absolutely loved. And that is supposed to be the source, right, of our confidence when we're afraid to go and put ourselves out to others. So that's all I've got. Maybe questions or comments from anybody? Yes.
I've heard this a lot, that it's like letters are better than
Which
kind
mode?
of why? Like you said that you can't, like, you have 1,000 friends and they're out, like there's no time and space. So is it that like you literally have to do them one by one?
I think so. I think it's a combination. Like sometimes there's people that you've met in life and they're good, but there might be a reason why you didn't stay super close. Maybe you just didn't quite have enough of a bond, right? But there might be some old friends that you just did and you really wish, like you sincerely wish you could keep up with, right? But the truth is, time and space keeps you from being able to, because you have obligations to those, right, proximate to you, your immediate family, those closest to you, your neighbor, like there's going to be that, right? And so I think that's why we have something beautiful to look forward to in heaven, where there is no time and space, so that everyone in heaven in the community of saints is truly going to be best friends. It's the best friends club, right? We really are going to be able to experience that. So sometimes it's genuine sacrifice. You're like, and all you can do maybe is that little Christmas card or something. Like there seriously are people in my life. I've been so blessed with great friends that I wish that I could keep up with more people. But in terms of the letter, I'd say there's something about a letter, because a letter is not instantaneous, right? We know that if you're going to mail a letter, really, it's not going to get there for a few days, right? And you sit down and you don't just sort of start stream of consciousness. You sort of have to compose yourself. You really do. When you compose yourself, you kind of gather yourself in. It's not straight up emotional word vomit, right? You're actually a little more
other focused, you're realizing they're gonna receive this in a few days, or maybe in a few weeks if they're overseas, right? And so I think there's something about, in a letter, you do have the capacity sometimes to be more other-centered, less overly emotional. Maybe emotions, not that emotions are bad, but you don't want to just, again, this sort of emotional word vomit, how I'm feeling now, boom, 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 you know, which we sometimes get with the instantaneous communication, you know. So I think there can be something in a letter, while it's not perfect, that anticipates the other's feelings and thoughts, that requires an effort to really kind of compose ourselves and think about what we're thinking and feeling and why. And so in the end, sometimes you just get something that's a little bit more satisfying on the other end, because it's like quality. You're like, wow, this person was thinking of me, and they were thinking of me, you know, a week ago, and they went to the store and bought this card, or they wrote this out and they put the mail back. You, as a receiver, right, you're sort of touched by the amount of effort, and you experience it. Like, I've made a joke before on my birthday, when I just get birthday texts from my 8 siblings. Like, I'm glad they remembered, but it's just kind of like, you know, like, and my one sister went out, and I mean, it was just like a greeting card. It's not like she hand-scrolled, you know, a fancy calligraphy, but I knew that she went to the store, you know, 4 days ago and was thinking of me and planning. I don't know, it touched me, because that physical effort sort of translated into just more of her. And so I think that, again, we can do this, like, because I'm so old, my friends and I, when we write emails to each other, they're like letters. They're like totally like paragraphs and composed, like we totally like, we write emails like letters. And you know, people are like, Mom, that's a really long email. It's just what we do, okay? We're old, but I think, again, to some degree, it doesn't mean that just because you can't have 1,000 friends that those people aren't worth it. It's just, again, that's sort of something we look forward to in the next life. But I do think in terms of quality communication, there can be something about a letter. And I remember growing up, sometimes if you wrote a letter in a very emotional state, you know, it's still sitting there the next day, you gotta put the stamp on it. Like, very often people would read the letters. They'd be like, yeah, I was really emotional last night, you know? And I remember somebody told me, they're like, well, you know, Mrs. Stanford, we do this too with emails. You're just supposed to hit save as draft after you write it. And I was like, okay, well, that's an option, right? But sometimes, you know, now that even that is more replaced with texting, you know, you do get a lot of boom, boom, emotional in the moment, and it's less, there's just less depth. And sometimes I would compare it to like having a candy bar versus like a full meal. I mean, don't get me wrong, if any of you challenged me to eat a bag of candy bars, I would beat all of you. There's no doubt, right? Boom, 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 right. But like, we're not supposed to do that, right? And ultimately, it's not really satisfying. You still need like your protein, although it's Snickers have protein, so. But nonetheless, I know, see, that would have been perfect. Okay, I'll do that next time. So there's this idea of there's something very exciting about the instantaneous nature of communication, but it does tend to be more of the moment, more stream of consciousness, more feelings right now, and then it doesn't have that satisfying depth that only reflection and time, right, can have when you actually put thought and compose something. So I think time is a creature, right? It translates into depth. So I think, again, using it as a convenience, there's so many thousand ways in which we experience the conveniences of these kinds of communication, but when it becomes sort of our sole means or our preferred mode, that's when we can start feeling impoverished. Yes, Paige.
So, like the world that we live in, technology is all around us, and like we can't really, I mean, it'd be very hard to do without it. At what age do you think it can be like introduced to a person, and like how can they learn to balance it?
I know. I mean, that's such a great question. I'll just make 2 quick comments. Like, our family's different, not judging every family. We waited until college. And I'm like the mean mom because I didn't let my kids have emails. The only reason I didn't was because, you know, when the mail comes, how many times does the mail come? Well, the Amazon packages are coming all the way, but and if you're going to get a letter or a card, right, it comes once a day. And you know when you're waiting for something, you're and then the mailman comes and there's no letter, and you go, okay, you can actually forget about it for a while. You go back to what you're doing and you can concentrate, right? Because an email could conceivably come any time, it's like in a child's head, it's keeping them from concentrating from the object at hand, because it's this whole, I just gotta tell you, imagine if you thought the mailman could literally come back like 14 times a day. You'd always be watching for him. You know, you wouldn't be able to enter in and concentrate. And so thing is, I guess because there is so much technology in other ways, I've had people say, well, your daughter will never learn to use her cell phone. Right, haha. No, kids get it, right? They're intuitive, they'll figure it out, right? But what I wanted to mention too is that we always assume that because it's the way of the world and it's the way of the workforce, that it's always good at work, it's just difficult with social things. Well, there's been a book by a guy at Georgetown, and it's called Deep Work. And it's about how people at their jobs in the professional world are struggling to solve engineering problems, tackle complicated legal issues. He looked at many different kinds of professional work because the technology is, now that you can be reached by 6 different bosses in 6 different methods, you just ding, ding, it's that is actually keeping people from doing quality work and solving problems that require concentration. So there's actually a kind of movement to try to simplify and to try to provide some modes that are again, just more simplified to promote focus. So I guess that's something I'd say too, though. It's not like, well, we all know the world needs it, we can't avoid it, So I guess what I'd also recommend is just, fine, we're gonna incorporate some technology, but we can't forsake all of the embodied activities, again, and it starts in the family. Playing games together, turning off the TV, having a conversation. Those kind of things you actually have to work hard to create the conditions for, because it's just really easy to have things slip in.
I have 2 questions for you on the first question. Kind of on Martha's question, you mentioned email kind of as a letter, but that is using technology. So would you
Yeah.
not?
It's
Like, what do you say about that?
I'd say, you probably can get something similar to a letter in an email if you approach it the right way. However, there is something, there's certain traces of the person's body in the handwriting, and then again, the efforts that you see. And again, I've received very fancy and pretty email birthday cards before, still not as satisfying. So it's like what we're talking about is sort of this, there's a certain satisfaction that you feel when you have an authentic relationship with somebody. And so this is just a small example. And we don't judge or get mad at our family if they send us a little text like that. But I do still think there's it is one more trace removed, I guess, from bodily, the signs of a person's physical. But, not the end of the world. Just an example, though, that